Thank you all for joining us. It's a beautiful evening, so I appreciate you all taking the time to sit with us tonight. Tonight's webinar is on the impact of climate change on Newfoundland and Labrador fisheries, presented by the Social Justice Co-operative and the Memorial University Climate Action Coalition. My name is Carrie Claire Neal. I am the co-chair of the Social Justice Co-operative, the SJC rep on the MUN Climate Action Coalition, and the incoming alumni representative on the Memorial University Board of Regents. I'm so excited to be here hosting tonight's webinar and to have so many people join us for this important discussion. Climate change is the natural response our Earth is having to environmental destruction. We know that pollution caused by processes like drilling oil and minerals, driving cars, and manufacturing chemicals is warming the temperature of the air and oceans, and that plastics are choking our ecosystems. As more land is being cleared for industrial purposes, we are losing important habitats for plants and animals that keep our world in balance. I want to first acknowledge the land and water protectors throughout Canada and the world who have been resisting this extraction economy and who have been marginalized and killed for their resistance. As we work towards truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous partners, we must join their fight to protect this land and each other from further harm. I also want to thank you all for taking the time to join us for this conversation. A global problem like climate change can feel really overwhelming, and it's so important that we work together on this front. Education and awareness are important first steps. We welcome you all to take the next step and get involved in local environmental justice activism in your community by joining groups like the Social Justice Cooperative and the Memorial University Climate Action Coalition. The Social Justice Cooperative is a volunteer-led, member-owned, nonprofit cooperative. We believe in the power of grassroots organizing, and our mandate is to help initiate, build, support, and grow organizations, networks, coalitions, and movements that take action towards social and environmental justice. The Memorial University Climate Action Coalition is a collection of students, faculty, staff, and community members with the shared interest of pursuing climate action at Memorial University through the power of grassroots and collective organizing. If you would like to learn more about these initiatives, please feel free to email socialjusticecoopnl@gmail.com or admin@muncac.ca. And I'm just going to pop that into the chat. Our plan for tonight's webinar is to acknowledge both the expertise of our panelists and our guests by making the space as interactive as possible. We will be asking our panelists 3 questions. And after each question, I will open the floor for about 15 minutes to hear from you, our audience, to see if you have any comments you would like to share. I will ask that you keep your comments short, about 3 to 5 minutes max, so we can have space to hear from as many people as possible. If you would like to speak, please say so in the chat, and I will unmute and call on you. You can find the chat in the upper right-hand side of your window. To be respectful of everyone's time, I will give you a warning if to wrap up a long speech, and will mute you if necessary. This goes for the panelists as well. After the panel, we will be extending the Q&A until 9 o'clock to give more room for discussion, and we will be taking questions from the audience here and from our guests watching along on Facebook streams. I should warn you that tonight's webinar is being recorded and streamed live on our Facebook pages. We will also be using notes from tonight's discussion to help steer the work of the Social Justice Cooperative and the MUN Climate Action Coalition on this front. This will include notes from the chat, so if you have any comments you would like to share, please feel free to do so there as well. Now I will introduce the panelists. Kimberly Orren, along with her husband Leo Hearn, founded Fishing for Success in Petty Harbor in 2014, a nonprofit that celebrates and teaches the traditional fishing knowledge and skills that were once the mainstay of Outport, Newfoundland and Labrador. Since 2016, this has included a safe space for girls and women to talk about an industry that is male-dominated and to learn some practical skills needed to change that, all while catching a few cod. Dr. Tyler Eddy is a research scientist in the Center for Fisheries Ecosystems Research at the Fisheries and Marine Institute at Memorial University. He is interested in past, present, and future human interactions with and ecology of marine ecosystems. He has experience in marine ecology, fisheries, climate change, ecosystem modeling, marine conservation, and historical ecology. Dr. Eddy's work has contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Dr. Paul Foley is Assistant Professor in the Environmental Policy Institute at Memorial University's Grenfell campus in Corner Brook. Dr. Foley's research has focused on transnational environmental certification and eco-labeling in the fisheries sector. He has conducted research on fisheries policy and regional development in Newfoundland and Labrador's shrimp fisheries. Thank you to our panelists for joining us for this discussion. I will get started now with the first question, and we'll call on our panelists in rotating order. So first, based on your research and experience, how is climate change impacting our fisheries? I will start with Dr. Tyler Eddy, and then go to Kimberly, and then Dr. Paul Foley. So Tyler, now you can start.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Carrie, for the invitation to participate in this exciting panel discussion. It's cool to be on a panel with people of different expertise and not just natural scientists who I'm oftentimes working with. So I have to give a bit of a disclaimer. I'm from Nova Scotia and I've just moved to Newfoundland in November, just in time for all the festivities. So I'm still getting up to speed on all of the intricacies of the local fisheries, but being from Nova Scotia, I'm aware of some of the issues that are at play here. And I've had quite a bit of experience working with marine ecosystems and climate change in general on more of a global scale. And I'm working to apply those approaches to the Newfoundland and Labrador situation. So to answer the first question about how climate change impacts our fisheries, I'm just going to walk you through sort of the basic approaches that we take as natural scientists in terms of how we understand the impacts climate change is having. So these are kind of historical observations, and then as well as some of the future modeling that we do in order to try to project what we'd expect to happen in the future. So we know on a global scale that temperatures are increasing both on land and in the ocean. However, there's a lot of regional variability. So some areas of the ocean are actually cooling while other areas of the ocean are warming. So it's not that, the whole ocean is all warming at the same rate. And in general, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we've seen rising sea surface temperatures. However, in the past few years, we've seen that some of the Newfoundland and Labrador coasts are actually cooling while the southern coast is increasing in temperature. So there's some of that regional variability observed right here in Newfoundland and Labrador. The base of the food chain is phytoplankton, which uses nutrients and sunlight in order to produce biomass and energy that can be passed up through the food web. And in recent years, we've seen a decrease in primary productivity in the Newfoundland and Labrador region. So basically, there's less energy and biomass available in the entire system to get passed up through the food web. We've also seen changes in the zooplankton community. So these are the larger plankton that would feed on phytoplankton. And we've seen decreases in abundance of calanus and increases in abundance of non-copepods. So this really has implications for the different pathways through the food webs, because some fish will prefer calanus, some fish will prefer other types of zooplankton. So if we're changing the food available, we could expect that would affect the fish that feed upon them. If we look at the demersal community, so this is the fish that live on the bottom, on the Grand Banks and on the Labrador Shelf, we know that the population of cod obviously is much reduced from what it was historically, and the recovery of cod and other demersal species has been a lot slower than expected. And it's been thought that this reduced productivity of the system is a contributing factor. Following that decline in cod, there was large increases in invertebrate species such as northern shrimp and snow crab, and we saw fisheries really capitalized on that. However, in recent years, those numbers have come down as well, and fisheries catches has come down as well. So in recent years, we've really seen a reduction in sort of the productivity across the entire ecosystem. Now, when we start integrating all of these different changes in sort of an ecosystem or a food web approach, we can see that the level of complexity increases very quickly. So, you reduce one species and then it can impact everything that feeds upon it. And then, that has ripple effects through the entire food web. So these are sort of the historical observations that we've observed so far in the Newfoundland and Labrador region. And we can build models based on, a representation of the ecosystem and who's eating who, and then change ocean temperature and ocean productivity based on what our climate change projections suggest, and come up with some predictions of what might be available for future fish, for fisheries in Newfoundland. And in general, under both low emissions and high emissions scenarios, we see an overall reduction in fish biomass in the Newfoundland and Labrador region. However, it should be noted that with more emissions, we see a greater reduction. So the less emissions that we produce, the less amount of reduction in fish. So that really is a strong argument. If we're thinking about the future of Newfoundland fish and fisheries, we should really try to reduce our emissions in order to have more that will be available for the future. So I'll probably leave it there. And if there's any questions or anyone wishes to comment further on any of the details, I'd be happy to speak to it. So thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. Next is Kimberly.
And I'll echo Tyler on thanking everyone involved in pulling this together this evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. How does climate change impact our fisheries? A really huge question. And so first, I guess, the idea about what we define as fisheries. If we think about, are we talking about commercial fisheries? Are we talking about this other thing over here that we tend to call recreational fisheries? What kind of fisheries are we talking about? And then I also try to remind people too that when we're talking about a fishery, we also tend to leave out the people that are involved. And so I oftentimes will tweet out that fishery equals fish plus people, and that we have to remember that if we're going to prosecute a fishery, besides keeping an eye on what's happening to the fish in all of this climate change, we need to think about what's happening to the people and the communities and what all of that means, and keeping the people engaged with the environment as we try to adapt to these changes. And so just keeping that in mind. And so just to remind people, of course, I am a practitioner, so I come from a very different place than the two gentlemen on the panel, and that I'm working at that interface between taking the research and trying to actually, put it into this hands-on programming, and that's where I come from. My background is academic, and when I decided to teach children to fish, I went back to graduate school in aquatic sciences and fisheries, and here I am trying to take all of this research and put it into practical applications. But so what does climate change then impact fisheries? And I'm coming at it from the people viewpoint. So as weather becomes rougher, it's going to impact how often humans are going to be actually able to get out in the water. And that's going to be important. As the fish start to move, because the water is getting warmer, and we start to see different kinds of fish around, that's going to change, the types of fisheries that people have access to. So keeping an eye on all of those kinds of things and developing policy that can respond very quickly to those changes that occur so that people can participate in the fisheries that are responding to climate change is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Next is Paul.
Thanks, Carrie. And I'd like to echo Tyler and Kimberly in thanking the organizers. Really interesting event, an important event. My first point on the question would actually maybe bring together the two key points I think we've heard already. One point I wanted to make is that there's sort of two overall linked consequences of climate change on fisheries in Newfoundland. And the first is those sort of environmentally and biophysically driven ones that Tyler focused on, how it will affect fish, food webs, the ability to catch fish, maybe what types of fish and what quantities, and how it affects people who rely on fish for a living, including the weather, extreme weather events that Kimberly mentioned. there are a set of other sort of impacts that I think are important as well, sort of how climate change is affecting how different parts of society responds and interacts. So social, economic, political institutions and organizations and actors are responding to climate change in ways that also in turn have impacts on the fishery. So one example clearly is global pressures and requirements to move towards a decarbonized or low carbon or post carbon economy, right? So this is not having a big impact here. It's not really on the agenda of the fisheries locally or much nationally or internationally. But I expect at some point this will have major impacts in terms of vessels that, particularly the energy intensive type vessels and types of fisheries. So just to give maybe a few other examples of those, I think Tyler's covered the environmental changes really well, and over a long term, we see major transformations and shifts, right? The crab and shrimp proliferated there for decades, and now they're likely in shifting or being complicated. Lobster fisheries might, and those who rely on lobster fisheries might benefit, and so there's a whole series of questions in terms of the people impacts that Kimberly was talking about climate change winners, right? So I think from a social justice perspective, that's a really important question of who can adapt to that. There's a couple of other examples I'd like to give is in terms of how fisheries management institutions are responding. So how are decisions going to be made about these changing fish patterns and fish locations, seasonality? Fisheries tend to be made on sort of an annual basis, so with a focus on one species. But these are very complex ecosystem changes, right? So from a social justice perspective, again, how will this affect different social group with different resources and capacity to access resources, for example, or access, fish for food? So those are big questions. And also, I anticipate, major market-driven impacts, and we're starting to see these now. Is how will markets change? And these are generally to the types of fishery, type fisheries. But will people even stop? Some people internationally stop eating fish that are considered contributing to high carbon emissions, right? So larger scale fisheries. Will powerful market players force fisheries and seafood traders to reduce carbon emissions in terms of climate change mitigation? Obviously necessary from a perspective of emissions reduction, but also, there might be questions about how that might undermine fisheries and people who can afford to rapidly change and adapt to what might be expensive transitions to low carbon economies. In other words, who will be the winners and losers of this process is really important. In terms of livelihoods, individuals, families, households, communities, food systems, and food security. So that's one thing I'd like to emphasize starting off is that, there are at least, the ecologically driven and biophysical driven impacts, but also very complicated societal impacts that will vary across space and time, and with different consequences for different groups of people.
Great, thank you all for that. Great start. I am going to open it up to the audience for 15 minutes. If anyone has any comments they'd like to share about their research or experience, seeing how climate change has impacted the fisheries. As mentioned, fisheries, fish plus people. So yeah, if you have any thoughts you'd like to share, you can kind of raise your hand in the chat just by saying hey, I want to speak, or letting us know. I will open it up for a minute, see if anyone would like to jump in. It's a more technical question, so maybe people will have more to say in the next question. All right, I guess we will move on. So next we were gonna ask our panelists how can communities build resilience and work to mitigate climate change? So for this one, I'm going to start with Kimberly, and then we'll move to Paul and then Tyler. So Kimberly, over to you.
If we think about building resilience, I think communities have to call on diversity and what does that look like? And so, it's interesting that as we're talking about this, we're hearing all of the calls now for, for Black Lives Matter, and this month is Pride Month, and also last week was National Indigenous Peoples Day week celebrations, and this recognition that we have a an industry, if you want to call it that, an industry that is still primarily run by, especially in North America, white males. And when you have an industry that's run by one group of people, you tend to get, same input, same output. And I think that just like any ecosystem, if you have very limited species within that ecosystem, you're not going to have a very resilient ecosystem. So just as we talk about ecosystems being resilient when they are very biodiverse, I think it's the same thing when we're talking about our communities. Our industry, our industry needs to look very much like what our communities look like, and so we should be working towards that. If you think about who is registered through Professional Fish Harvester Certification Board, for example, about 20% are women. About 5% of the enterprises are owned by women. And I don't know that there are any race or ethnic data that's collected here in Newfoundland and Labrador on that. So I would really like to see the data on all of that. So that's something that really should be brought forward. Providing access, which we touched on very briefly, that's really important. That's 114B from that UN Sustainable Development Goals. And once we talk about providing access all the way across for fish as food and subsistence fishing, that's going to be very important as we look at how the global food chain is going to be possibly more brittle as these effects of global climate change or COVID-19 become very much more obvious. And so providing food sovereignty to communities is more important. I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Kimberly. Next is Paul.
Right. So, I don't know exactly how communities are responding in the entire province right now. So that's actually an important question that I from a research perspective, I think would be helpful for us or me to know to better answer the question. So what is being done now? How are communities responding? Are they being reactive, proactive? To what extent is climate change and fisheries impacts on the agenda? What's the relationship between communities and the people and organizations who catch and process fish and who support those communities? What are they doing? What can we learn from them? What can we do to increase their capacity to adapt to climate change? I think municipalities NL has been in recent years putting fisheries more clearly on their agenda, and maybe some interactions with the fishing industry or parts of it that weren't present years ago. So it seems to be getting some steam. In any case, I think one step will be to hear from them, right? So to learn what the communities themselves are doing or not doing, what they can do, what they can't do right now, so as to better prepare for what's to come. My key challenge here, I think Kimberly has really mentioned this, is also to learn about the barriers and challenges constraining communities as they seek to build resilience. So one example here is social and institutional fragmentation and marginalization. And one example of that is different claims on who should speak for and about the fisheries. So who speaks for fisheries is sort of a contested topic and question with many different interest groups, different authorities. Obviously, DFO has constitutional and legal authority, but when we say fisheries, there are a wide range of organizations and interest groups, from fish harvesters fish worker organizations, co-ops, small processors, large corporations, also government, environmental NGOs, researchers, and scientists. So, and all these different groups tend to come at the fishery from a bit of a different perspective with different information, expertise, priorities, and values. So, and also, and this is really important, they tend to have very different power and capacity and resources. So there are complex institutional and social constraints and interactions that will, I think, influence communities going forward. Second, and Kimberly mentioned this as well, is how can marginalized voices be heard? The groups I just mentioned, for example, are generally well established, well resources, but what can we do to better avoid ignoring the agency of youth, women, people of color, and others who are not as well represented in the organizations and institutions that hold power, whether it's municipalities, government agencies, corporations, NGOs, etc. And so we're also seeing that worldwide, the challenge of institutional and systematic racism, right? So, and Kimberly mentioned this as well, that discussions of fisheries in Newfoundland and elsewhere in North America, what we tend to see and hear about, and I'm a part of this process, are generally part of a sort of European colonial and settler history of types of fisheries and people involved. So much of these institutions and processes are also very Eurocentric. So as societies change, we also need to be aware that, to build social and institutional resilience that is more sensitive to those historical legacies, which are sometimes hard to change, right? So the general point here, I guess, is that building resilience involves very complex social and institutional challenges. So overcoming those involves building awareness and understanding, trust, challenging powerful actors and common assumptions, and changing institutions and values, right? Again, these are big, challenging areas and topics. I'll leave it at there for now. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Next is Tyler.
Okay, so this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse in terms of my area of specialty, but I'm more familiar with the biophysical changes that we're expected to see. And so this sort of speaks to what Paul was mentioning earlier in terms of the resource availability that is available to communities is expected to change with climate change. So the fish that you may have fished traditionally and that you have the gear for and that you have the boats for may no longer become available. And different species that perhaps weren't targeted in the past might become more of a resource, and there could be greater availability. So I think thinking about how different communities could adapt and react to changing availability of resources is something to consider. I think of the example of the American lobster, which, Maine used to make its bread and butter off of the lobster, and right now, with climate change, the edge of the range of lobster is really being pushed northward to the point where, catches in Maine and New England coast are a lot lower than they have been historically. Nova Scotia is kind of in the sweet spot right now, and they're having record catches. And we're starting to see more and more populations of lobster show up in Newfoundland. So, are the communities able to adapt and tap into these changing availability of resources through time? And I think part and parcel with not only the changing in resource availability is whether or not the management authority is able to react in a dynamic fashion in order to be able to accommodate fishers and communities to allow them to capitalize on these changing resources. So I've heard DFO be called a lot of things in the past, but I've never heard them called dynamic. So I think under climate change in the future, having more dynamic management and really being prepared for these changes in resource availability and changes in the needs of the community and the fishers, and really having this dialogue, I think will be important. And having an ecosystem approach to a fishery rather than managing all these individual single species, which we know interact with each other. We know they're influenced by the environmental conditions and climate change. And I know there is some good work at DFO that is moving in that direction, but I would keep pushing them to be on the leading edge of that. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. So I'm going to open up the floor again to see if anyone in our audience would like to answer this question. I I know maybe if I say something controversial, it'll help. But I think, oh, Jack, yes, please go ahead.
Hey everyone. Um, yeah, I was just thinking about this question when we're, talking a lot about at the community level, and Canada has international agreements that discuss these issues, that discuss coastal communities and climate change, but there's very few, at least what I've seen, federal regulations around that. In the past couple of years, we've invested in infrastructure for small island developing states to adapt to climate change. We push a lot about gender and women's rights when it comes to issues around small island developing states and fisheries abroad. We've also signed on to the small scale fisheries guidelines, which explicitly state that we should address climate change, climate disaster risks. And so I think, there's a lot of push for DFO and the federal government to recognize that these challenges are happening in Newfoundland, and there needs to be funding for that, and that it's not only an economic challenge, that it's a challenge that's going to affect households, women, also, people of lower income more. And so I think there are the tools at the table that are there that Canada has signed on to, that Canada invests in other places. And so it may be also a point of kind of putting the mirror back and saying, this is what you're kind of preaching globally, but what are we doing back home? That's just my quick point. Thank you.
That's a great point. Thank you, Jack. If anyone else has any comments they'd like to share, please let us know in the chat.
Carrie, if I could jump in while we wait for some others. Oh, looks like someone has a question.
Question to Paul. You mentioned about changing values. What kind of values are you referring to and how to change them?
Okay, maybe I'll tie this in with what I was the comment I was going to make. So, even if we look at DFO, for example, or the institutions that Jack I think referred to, DFO historically has generally managed ecological criteria, right? In terms of how much fish are being taken from the sea. And is that maximum sustainable yield approach, as well as economic considerations. Recently, they've actually agreed to make changes federally, the Parliament of Canada, to the Fisheries Act to include social and cultural factors and values in considerations of fisheries management. So that's I would say, in terms of similar to what Jack was saying, a huge window of opportunity. Now it could fizzle away, and the institutions could create or just leave up other barriers that bureaucracies tend to do. But that opens up a real large opportunity that at least wasn't there a couple of years ago, when DFO could put their hands up and say, well, the minister is not supposed to consider social and cultural issues when it comes to fisheries. We're just basically a sustainable stock fishery. So there are some policy documents that one can refer to actually look at those. Then there's a whole set of other values that we, beyond DFO, of course, and looking at communities. And my approach to that will be, well, asking the communities what they value, right? Or asking, people what they value in terms of, producing for food, producing for income, livelihood, community sustainability, the ability to maintain coastal rural communities in contexts which are really challenging with few other economic and development opportunities, right, in some of these regions of Newfoundland and Labrador. So.
Thank you, Paul. We got a question from the live stream that I'm going to save maybe till the end. Kimberly, you want to jump in, and then we'll go to Barry.
I do want to jump in and respond here to Paul's, and I'm going to do that screen share thing, and hopefully you see values up here. So this was actually some research that was done over on the West Coast here by EcoTrust Canada, and they actually asked commercial fishermen what they value about their commercial fishery. So you think if they ask commercial fishermen what they value about their commercial fishery, which is where they earn their money, you think money would be really top on the list? But what you see, look at the thickened lines, what they value most is culture and intergenerational connections. And you see money, it's got the thinnest lines to it. And so the value that we place on a fishery, even if it's the commercial one, it's not the first one that we think. It's our culture, its connection with our grandchildren and other generations in our community, and it really is that networking and connections among all of the members in our community. So I think remembering that is very important. So heritage really is it's a big thing. It's not just about the commodity. I did want to build that up behind Paul's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Barry, you have a question. Go ahead. I think you're on mute there.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. A question mainly to Paul, and it's about the dilemma I think we have with respect to the power of DFO to make policy without any legitimate input from others. They are in charge of the science, which is quite complicated, but the fish management policy, the harvesting plans, for anyone to have a idea of what to do if they're a harvester, they need to know beforehand. Right now, we don't know, harvesters don't know, recreational harvesters, food fishery people don't know what the rules are going to be until just days and sometimes only weeks or even a month or so before the time comes. And there doesn't seem to be very many ways in which ordinary people can actually affect fishery policy. And I've looked at some of the things that we do now, in particularly the idea that the only tool we have is to reduce harvesting, and which we've been doing now for pretty well 27 years. And we're having a terribly large fishing mortality, natural mortality, when the fishing mortality is quite small. But how do people outside of DFO get to have some meaningful input into the management decisions of DFO? I don't know if Paul can add anything to that.
Yeah, I can. That's a huge challenge to answer that one. If I could answer it easily, I'd be a popular person in a lot of places. But there's several layers of issues. One, like large bureaucracies in general. If you're a political scientist studying institutions, they tend to create those barriers of entry and controlling turf and controlling decisions. So there's partly a bureaucratic problem. There's sort of historical problems with the way those institutions and processes have been set up. So it's really hard to change. One thing I would think about from my perspective as a researcher, I'd be really interested to learn from people who have been able to kind of affect change, because I think there are examples, and we know there are plenty of examples where there's mostly barriers and just a challenge to actually affect policy. But one that I've researched myself in terms of the shrimp fishery, and this is relatively large and semi-industrial fishery, of course, but it's fascinating to learn about the early 1990s when the shrimp fishery was purely a factory freezer, megatrawler type fishery. And as the waters changed, basically, shrimp exploded in abundance. And the minister was faced with the opportunity basically to, just give more quota to the existing license holders. But I think groups, municipalities became aware of it, the FFAW and other fish harvesters became aware of it, and they really fought to try to get access, and there was significant access throughout the province. Again, there's a whole history there, but it's an example where that there was a major policy shift in allowing smaller scale folks to actually access the fishery. Again, there's still people excluded from that one. It's still relatively large scale, but there are policy windows and opportunities where you can affect change. But that would be my answer without really answering it. Is looking for talking to people who have examples of uh, making change and affecting policy. And there are, really, I think, innovative and progressive people within DFO here and there that it might be more productive to work with and speak to, who might be more sensitive and understanding of the challenges and the issues. So that's another side of it. Yeah.
I think one of the first things that we have to do is to keep driving home the need to change the name. It shouldn't be called recreational groundfish fishery because the word recreational seems as if it's not important, if it's not really necessary, it's something you do if you have some extra time, some extra money to burn. It's like going to the movies. It's like buying a pair of roller skates. It's really not that important. It's like the last thing on your list. It is a vital human activity. It is something that defines anyone as a human in any culture across history. It's the first thing humans did when they could waddle down to the shore, whether it was to collect oysters, whatever it was. It's something that's inspired us to create literature and art and music, and the first paintings in Spanish caves tens of thousands of years ago were of salmon. It's something that has inspired us from the very beginning. And you talk about biblical terms like Jesus casting a net and fishers of men, and the Islam fish that holds up the earth, and all of these things that you can talk about, and we're not even allowed to go out and fish and get a meal. And then you talk about things about like food sovereignty and understanding where your food comes from, and teaching children about the meaning of nature and connecting with the ocean, because right now the ocean is the center of climate change, and they need to understand why the ocean is so important. But yet we don't have a reason to get them to the ocean unless it's Saturday, Sunday, or Monday, and it's a recreational activity. Like we've got to fight for it to be called a food fishery. Food is vital. Food is at the center of every cultural activity that we participate in. You go to a celebration or you go to a funeral, and food is there at the center of it. And no matter the culture, whether you lived, it's at oceans or rivers or streams or lakes or ponds, your culture has fished throughout time. So I think we need to fight to get that word changed. As long as it's called recreational, we're not going to go anywhere with it.
Great, thank you. That was good conversation. I'm going to move on to the next question. Now, finally, what is the role of Memorial University and the Marine Institute in helping communities adapt to and mitigate the impact of climate change? So I'll start with Paul and then move to Tyler and then Kimberly. So Paul, over to you.
Yeah, I guess one thing is to, find a way to learn about, the various researchers who are already looking at this, lots of natural scientists working on it, some linked to the Ocean Frontier Institute, some social scientists and humanists have a really strong interest in this and are looking at it. Many of these people are sort of off in their own disciplines and areas and not really well connected. So that will be one thing that, within Memorial and Marine Institute that I think there could be more opportunities to collaborate. That's happening through the Ocean Frontier Institute and other initiatives. And of course, MUN and MI, part of our core mandate is to do research and develop new knowledge. Interdisciplinary research is really well established at MUN, so research involving partnerships, community, partnered research. There's a long, strong legacy at Memorial of this. in my field, Barb Neese, and before Barb there was Rosemary Omer. So there's a rich set of experiences and knowledge that can be used to build further experiences, organization and action. There's new researchers as well that come on stream, and some of whom I'm not as familiar with, and that's important to learn about what they're doing, the cutting edge work they're doing. So I'd be really interested to have sort of an inventory of who's working on what and bringing them together. I think that there's opportunities there. Building bridges across disciplines. Climate change adaptation is one area where there's a lot of research internationally, but also, I think somewhat at Memorial, right? And this is a big area for the social sciences, is how different groups and organizations and communities can adapt to climate change. So, Memorial might be able to help in that way. At the end of the day, too, I think it's critical, to the whole question is building linkages between fisheries and coastal communities and researchers. So working with partners and communities to build a better understanding of vulnerabilities and opportunities facing these communities, and supporting communities in developing knowledge and action to increase resilience, adaptive capacity in ways that are, sort of attentive to legacies of social injustice and inequities that continue to persist, that are still, very much a big constraint within what we want to do. And so organizing itself is really important, right? Whether it's with researchers and with communities. So building networks, organizing, and obviously the co-op is, you guys are well acquainted with the importance with that, but also the challenges, right? It's not easy to bring people together, time, resource intensive, and so forth, right? But those are a few reflections.
Thank you, Paul. Next is Tyler.
Okay. To echo Paul's comments on, being a science provider, being a knowledge provider, trying to provide the best advice to people who are making decisions. And in my field, this oftentimes requires working closely with DFO. They have a lot of resources in terms of doing all the scientific surveys, actually going out to the shelf and the Grand Banks and doing the surveys and collecting the data and providing, the scientists with the information that we need in order to, make these assessments and these evaluations. I think perhaps the role of Memorial University and Marine Institute can change through time. So, during our present government, there's a lot of funding for oceans research, and they're very happy for natural and environmental scientists to speak to the media and be open about our findings. It wasn't too long ago that wasn't the case, and I have a number of colleagues at DFO who weren't able to speak freely. So I think in those times, us as a university, we're a little bit more independent, and we can speak a little bit more freely about what's happening should, the appetite for environmental science and natural science change with a political agenda. So I think that's really a crucial sort of role for the university to play. Obviously, we're training the new scientists of the future, getting them in the field, teaching them the techniques so they can continue on the legacy of, providing the knowledge to the people that need it. And then also, working with the community, as Paul was mentioning before, trying to learn what we can gain from knowledge in these fishing communities of, areas that DFO might not get in and survey, and small scale fisheries that often, go under the radar of these large surveys that happen. So really, speaking with people, working with the communities, and trying to, have kind of a shared relationship and learning from them, and then hopefully, developing a conversation and a dialogue that goes both ways. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. And next is Kimberly.
Fishing for Success really, I think, owes a lot to Memorial University. The many departments at Memorial University have been very supportive of partnering with Fishing for Success, the social enterprise, the Center for Social Enterprise, the business department, certain areas within Marine Institute. Gosh, what else? Geology, geography. Um, when you start picking at it, it seems like fishing is connected to so many things, and so we've had a great time working with so many different departments at the university there. I would say when I was taking my industrial courses for my Fishing Masters 4 program at Marine Institute, I would have liked to have had a woman instructor in the program somewhere. That would have been great. There were no women instructors, and of course, um, yeah. So I was oftentimes the only woman in the class, and so and I actually had asked administration if they were targeting women to increase the uptake of women in the profession of fishing, and they said they did, that they invited women, and I asked them to if they could tell me what things they were actively doing to invite women, but they couldn't tell me specifically. So, it's tough when you invite women into space and you don't know what that looks like because yeah, so that's tough. Some of my gear didn't fit, which that's tough. I'm 5 foot tall, I get that, but so that was also it's snowy out and you're having to jump off the 25-foot pier into the water for your survival class, and your Gumby suit doesn't fit, and you just hope it doesn't leak when you jump in the water. So, having a suit that fit would be really cool. So things like that, just making certain that you are targeting your audience so that you improve the number and diversity of people in that profession. Because if we were to say that only 20% of any profession was women, say if that was in computers or something like that, we would be horrified and we would start like a Girls Who Code program, for example. But but we haven't really done anything for fishing. So yeah, what can we do to start targeted programming to improve that? And what does it look like to do those things? Because as a former high school teacher, if I can tell you that if don't who look like them in the textbook, they can't imagine themselves doing if they don't see teachers who look like them around the school, they can't imagine being teachers one day. So let's talk about what we can do. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. So yeah, we're going to open it up to the floor again. If anyone has any comments or questions they'd like to share about what they think the role of Memorial University and Marine Institute could play on this. I do want to give a shout out to MUN Extension Services. They were really important in the foundation of the Fogo Island Fisheries Co-operative and helping the community of Fogo Island resist resettlement by learning how to start a fishery cooperative. And it's still in production. It's still helping the community of Fogo Island thrive, and has been really important to its success. The Shorefast Foundation and the Fogo Island Inn couldn't have happened without that kind of fishery base. So I would love to see, I guess, more community-oriented research from the university. I don't know if anyone else has anything like that they'd like to share. We do have a question from Leah. She asks, what do we do when the university's biggest priority seems to be accepting money from big oil to do research that flies in the face of climate adaptation? I don't know if anyone to answer that one. Big one. We
I'll
also
jump in if
yeah.
no, can't leave the question unaddressed at least. I think this is a big challenge in terms of, I think, more generally Newfoundland's dependence on oil, right? I think Memorial is a part of that perhaps, but I think Newfoundland is in a huge dilemma with dependence on oil for economic development, jobs, and so forth. So Memorial's not immune from that. But going back to Kerry's example, I would say again, there still are windows of opportunity. They might not be as many as if the agenda was shifted, but there are windows of opportunity, and Kimberly's work and partnerships with the university are an example of that. The history of the Extension Service is as well. I'm actually from Fogo Island. I grew up in Tilting, so I know that case quite well. And it's also linked to the Torngat Fish Co-op in northern Labrador. Was also the Extension Service was involved there, and they helped inspire others. The St. Anthony Basin Resources Incorporated was sort of inspired by their experiences. So that just the presence of these different social enterprises and different social organizations in and of itself is a way in which to inspire new discussions, new research, new topics, and networks of action to make more progressive change, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul.
And now that Paul has opened the door, then maybe I'll follow up. So I think the recent open letter to the new president of Memorial is a good example of faculty and students and alumni trying to keep the university accountable to its commitments on climate change and reducing emissions. So really trying to keep the leadership accountable, and I'm very happy now that we have a female president, but I'd also like to see Memorial become a bit more progressive in terms of trying to be a leader and potentially, being an example for the rest of the province in terms of, how we might be able to transition the economy and start thinking a little bit differently. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. We have a question on coastal communities that I might wait for the Q&A. And maybe I know Barry has a question / comment to Tyler. Go ahead, Barry.
Is to act as a conduit or a venue between regular people or ordinary people who are interested in the fishery, as well as the university community itself, to get into DFO and get our ideas presented there. The question I had for Tyler was, a second, I get my glasses here. You talked about getting the research and assessments done at DFO. Can you give us a clear understanding of how DFO's harvesting planners translates the science and the research into a harvesting plan? The research and science can be quite complex. The whole ecosystem is involved. But harvesting rules are pretty simple. Who fishes? Where do they fish? When do they fish? What kind of gear do they use? It can be stated quite simply. But I haven't seen clearly how DFO translates all the science that they do into those very practical rules for harvesters and both commercial and people who fish for food. How they translate that, and because it makes some of it doesn't make any sense to me at all.
I'm going to jump in there on
Well,
that one.
I can, okay. Do you want to go first, Kimberly?
Yeah, I just want to jump in there for a second, Tyler, and then you can take it. But we have to keep in mind that DFO does great science, but then it gets filtered through politics, and I think that's where some of this stuff gets lost in translation. So, so then I'll let Tyler take it from here.
Yeah, so I was a part of a number of the assessment meetings that take place every spring at DFO, and that's basically where, as Kimberly suggested, they review the latest surveys, they review all the latest scientific information, and the scientists, as well as members from the different fisheries who are allowed to be present as well. We all review all the information, we go over it, fine tooth comb, make sure that there's no errors in the data. And then we provide advice in terms of if the stock is, increasing in size or decreasing in size. And then we provide that scientific advice, usually in the form of 2 or 3 bullet points, which, distills all of this information, which get passed to the people who make the harvest control rules and the policymakers. And from that point forward, I don't exactly understand the process. And I don't think there's a huge amount of transparency there. And having experience in working with US fisheries and New Zealand fisheries and Australian fisheries, which have very defined harvest control rules, it's a little bit gray here in Canada from my experience. Now, we were supposed to have a workshop that we were hosting at the Marine Institute in collaboration with DFO in October, which obviously has been postponed by a year. But this was really trying to look at dynamic reference points and dynamic harvest control rules, because there is an appetite within DFO to sort of standardize that methodology in the face of changing climate so that it's a bit more of a pragmatic and a straightforward approach. So there are some steps that are being taken, but beyond the science advice, I'm not an expert in how that actually gets translated into policy decisions.
I can add just one more, just one more aspect to that. I think Tyler's right. It's really complex and not clear in terms of what happens in some of the background. But institutionally, one of the reasons for that is in Canada you have constitutionally enshrined or legally enshrined ministerial discretion, right? So at the end of the day, they can put in all these policies and procedures to say we need to consider community sustainability, we need to consider this issue, that issue, food security, others. But there's this, constitutional provision or legally, in the Fisheries Act, I should say, indicating that the minister at the end of the day has discretion, which means they don't have to follow all those, those advice parameters. So whereas in the U.S. you might get a clearer sense of that the minister would just have to accept or just follow those guidelines. So that's one thing I think a lot of people have been frustrated with in the Canadian context of the ministerial discretion dimension.
Thank you. That was a really good question, Barry. Thank you all for your replies. There has been a few questions in the chat. One on climate policy that I'm going to maybe leave to the Q&A and open up the floor to Simon.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about the what MI and MUN can do, because I just finished a 4-year program at Marine Institute as a mariner in marine engineering, and I was just kind of thinking about how there's like this sort of Dutch disease phenomenon happening, but with oil and gas, but instead of manufacturing, it's kind of fisheries that are taking the brunt of the kind of wealth that you get from oil and gas, because I just noticed how so many of my classmates come from fisheries families, and they all and their families still do some fishing and whatnot, but all these young people go and they essentially work in oil and gas or in the more factory farm fisheries, because that's where all the money is. So, the problem with oil and gas and investing so much in it is you really do take away from these smaller case these like kind of smaller community-driven economies, and which is really important. And there's a lot of like ideas and technology that the Marine Institute could include in the fisheries for the vessels, because there's always instances where there's a lot of problems with some of these boats capsizing, and there's engineering problems, but there's no focus really at that at the Marine Institute. So it'd be kind of cool to see a sort of shift towards that, where we kind of help or like at least provide some focus to that area rather than, oil and gas and the industrial fishing trawlers. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you, Simon. There are some comments in the chat, I guess related to some of the earlier comments. Jack says there isn't transparency, there is framework after framework for the science side, but economic and social considerations are not considered in any formal way. Kimberly says the minister is the fairy godmother, and Barry asks, can we get someone to reprogram her wand? So if there aren't any more comments on what Marine can do, I think we might open up the floor for a more general Q&A. We have our Kimberly and Paul are able to stay until 9 should the conversation go that long. But Tyler has another meeting at 8:30. He's a busy man. So get your questions into Tyler right as soon as possible. So we did already have a question for Tyler. Victoria asks, if you can comment on the effect that climate change is intersecting with cumulative stressors to affect fish and fisheries.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that just highlights the complexity of the questions and the problems that we're trying to study. So you're right, climate change isn't happening in isolation. Fisheries aren't happening in isolation. We have impacts of pollution, coastal development, habitat loss. So all of these factors, compound on one another, and we often try to deal with as many of them as possible, but it often becomes the case that the question or the system becomes very complex very quickly. So then it's sometimes a strategy to try to isolate or look at one of these individual factors, such as climate change or such as fisheries, or the interaction between the two, and then bring in some other studies that might look at the impacts of pollution on recruitment of juvenile fish or invertebrates. But this is definitely the cutting edge of a lot of the work that I do, is really trying to come up with ways to deal with all of these different cumulative factors. So that is definitely the cutting edge of a lot of the research that I'm involved in.
Thank you, Tyler. And I do want to reiterate, I know a lot of people in our audience are also researching fisheries, so don't feel like you have to ask a question. You can also just comment or respond to a question that was asked. So feel free to jump in and do that. But of course, I put Tyler on the spot, so we have another question for him. The government is extremely interested in an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. Where do you see synergies with incorporating social justice/value considerations into ecosystem approaches?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you're right that there is a lot of interest from DFO. So I've only been at the Marine Institute for, I guess, 6 or 7 months now, but I've already established some collaborations with folks at DFO who work on these ecosystem-based approaches. And we have a couple project proposals that are in right now that we're waiting to hear back to see if they'll get funded. But it is trying to really introduce this ecosystem approach into the single species decision-making process. And part of it is also knowledge incorporation. So typically, a lot of the information that gets incorporated in these decisions is sort of the quantitative research survey, assessment methodology that fisheries science has been built on. But there's a recognized need to incorporate local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge into the decision-making process. And there is a little bit of, the system isn't really set up to do that. So we have to sort of come up with novel ways in order to figure out, how we are going to consider these types of information sources, that now that have been recognized that, we want to and are really important. So this is work that I hope I'll be working on in the future. And even if these projects don't get funded in the short term, I'm sure that, this will be something that I start to focus on in the future. So there's definitely a lot of interest in incorporating the ecosystem approach. It's not straightforward, but there are steps that are being taken to move it in that direction.
Thanks, Tyler. Jack, I don't know if you have a response to that or if you wanted to comment further. Great question. Okay, thanks. All right. So we have a question, I guess, for the whole panel. How can coastal communities become resilient to increasing scarcity in marine resources? By marine resources, this is from Victoria, she means fish and invertebrates. Anyone want to jump in on that one? Paul.
Um, you know, I would say we want to think a bit more about what's meant by scarcity, right? Like I think some fisheries obviously are getting more scarce, but there are some fish, and maybe climate change will help contribute to this. Oddly, is a greater abundance, right? So in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there's an explosion of redfish, and different industry groups and players are trying to figure out, including scientists, figure out how to get ready for that in terms of sustainable fishery. But there's really great anticipation for that growth. Lobster fishery, if you talk to many parts of the province, if you talk to lobster fishermen, they'll tell you that they're getting a lot more lobster lately. But other fisheries are certainly declining. You know, the shrimp fishery for a number of years now have been in a sort of contraction, and scarcity obviously with cod, and we have that legacy of cod for decades now of being scarce. So, I would say thinking about that, what types are scarce, but there might be opportunities for abundance. And giving communities a voice is important, right, in context of scarcity. Allowing them to shift to resources that might become more abundant is critical. I think so. Not assuming that one species goes down, it's all over. I think there's a long history of the fishing industry and different organizations being very adaptable and seeing opportunities in rising other fisheries and trying to take advantage of that. So I think that's important. As you see, if lobster became more abundant, for example, and that's a kind of fishery that's very amenable to small boats. Many women lead the boats on the south coast and own boats in the lobster fishery. So that's a kind of fishery might be really able to build and link to community resilience.
I'd like to lend a couple of points to that one also. When we think about some of the ways that our fish specifically, not so much the invertebrates, but really the fish is processed, in many plants still, when cod is processed, there's still so much waste that's not utilized, and if plants can't sell it to, the mink farm or whatever, there may be as much as 65% waste once they kill it and the tongues are removed. The other parts of the fish are highly labor intensive to remove and to use, and there's currently not a lot of ways to utilize the other parts of the fish. But there are young people who are interested in learning how to take fish skin and develop it into leather, or use otoliths to create things with them, or take the livers. And
Sorry, Kimberly, we're getting some feedback. It's a bit hard to hear. I don't know why. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, especially with the fish, there's a lack of utilization of the waste or byproduct or offal of the fish once you remove the fillet and the tongue. The other parts of the fish require a lot of labor to remove or to utilize. But yet, if you opened it up for young people, there's a possibility that they could create or develop products from it. Just something as simple as allowing young people to have access to the fish skin to produce leather would be really just something very simple that could be done. But there's really no mechanism or, nothing that's being done to allow that. So I think the idea about microprocessing or access to those kinds of materials is really an important discussion to start having. It's a value added kind of thing.
Thank you.
Were you able to hear me enough, or?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll just sit closer to my microphone.
Robin asked, on the subject of waste, there was some discussion of an ocean cluster for Newfoundland and Labrador, like they have in Iceland and New England. And I would wonder who are the actors you need involved to get a project like that off the ground?
Most of the problem is access to the materials. It's having access to the materials coming out of the fish plant and then not having to pay for it. Like a lot of times young people just don't have the money to invest in purchasing those materials up front. So there are some plants that have some really cool modernized equipment and they're utilizing all of those parts. But there are still some plants around Newfoundland and Labrador who aren't utilizing them. So it's just a matter of trying to track them down and developing an agreement with them. But that's a way that communities could maybe develop some resilience and provide opportunity for young people. But I think there was, what's the name, Carrie? Is it 3F? Ben Wiper, was it?
Yeah, I think so.
Name of his project? Yeah, I think he was developing something like that. I don't know how far along he's gotten in it. So, but it's a tough nut to crack to be able to get access to it. Yeah, so I haven't seen exactly which F of the 3F he's working on, or has most of it. Maybe Jack knows. Jack, what do you know about it?
Real quick, yeah, I think a lot of it is collagen and then cod skins, and he has a facility, but I'm not sure if it's like his home or if it's a facility. But he's making progress from what I've heard and following.
Yeah, is he making dog treats from the skin, or is he making shoe leather or leather just generally?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know in Fogo they have dog treats, and they've had dog treats for a while, but I'm not sure exactly what he's making with it. But
okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah. So just providing people access to that material. It's tough to get access to it. The other thing I think that limits a lot of adaptation to what you can do when you're not fishing is that Professional Fish Harvesters Certification Board requirement that during the fishing season, 75% of your income has to come from fishing. And so then you're really limited into what you can do. So you can't have a side gig as an electrician, for example, and then develop your fishing career. So you really have to dedicate yourself to fishing, and that's really tough to do when you're young. So, communities who are trying to get young people to stay and become fish harvesters, it's really tough. So I think looking at those PFHCB requirements for young fish harvesters would help.
Thanks, Kimberly. Next webinar, I'm getting you a set of headphones. We had another question for Paul before we get to Barry. Paul, could you detail more on how change in global policy with respect to climate action can impact local fisheries? You mentioned that decarbonizing and change in market demands have a ripple effect. Can you elaborate on such chain reactions and how it affects local fisheries?
Yeah, thanks for that question. A lot of my research starting in the PhD level was devoted to environmental sustainability certifications and eco-labeling, the Marine Stewardship Council in particular. So those are basically NGOs that decide to create, a sustainability logo, kind of like your fair trade coffee idea, and the idea is that maybe fishers and others around the world will all move towards sustainability. What happens in practice really is large companies who buy a lot of the fish will say, okay, we want to prove that we're sustainable. We'll buy the sustainability label, or we'll commit to buying fish that's only certified, and then it forces small and large scale fisheries into the fold, which these things are expensive, so it can have negative consequences from a socioeconomic perspective for small scale fisheries that might not be able to afford it, and then they get shut out of markets. For others, it might create new market access opportunities, right? But these are generally international commodity trade dynamics. So there's the whole market dimension, and I think one of the research questions I have is to what extent, and I have a master's student looking at this right now, is to what extent are reducing greenhouse gas emissions on the agenda internationally for fisheries. And her findings so far indicate that it's surprisingly not really high on the agenda, whereas it's certainly high on a lot of other industry agendas. So that's a really interesting thing that, again, the findings are preliminary, but what I would expect in the long term is that markets will start to decide we're only going to buy fish that are from low carbon fisheries, hypothetically. So that would be that would really change the dynamic of fisheries around the world potentially. I don't think it's going to happen that simple or that fast, but that's a potential scenario. Another set of, I guess, global forces and dynamics are those at the United Nations level. I think Jack mentioned some examples of commitments by the Canadian government to international treaties and protocols. The United Nations has the sustainability goals, and I think Kimberly mentioned some of those. So those are things that can actually increase opportunities as well. That the United Nations built a framework asking nation states to commit to ways to support small-scale fisheries and access to resources, access to markets. So those are ways in which international changes and governing institutions can open up opportunities for small-scale fisheries and different interests. And some of those have been informed by small-scale organized interests around the world too, right? So it's not as if the leaders of these organizations are just doing it out of benevolence. They're being pressured by small-scale groups around the world and different organized groups as well.
I'd like to add something to Paul's discussion about the low carbon emission fisheries. Share some work that was done here by Polly. Should have a diagram here of large scale versus small scale. Is that what you see? So you can see the small scale is 15 meters or less, and it's versus the large scale boat. So if you're talking about the annual fuel oil consumption of the boats, you can see small scale is much less. And it also compares to the fish that they catch. And the cool thing about it too, which I know the social justice cooperative would be very interested in, is the employment. The number of people that are employed. So it's small-scale fisheries is a win-win across the board. It's a low carbon emission. It provides more food. It employs more people, and it also produces very little discard at sea. So it's a great win-win for all of us. And so those smaller boats in the harbor around the small communities in Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, would contribute to resiliency of our rural communities here. And I'd love to throw this up.
Thank you, Kimberly. We're approaching 8:30, so I will say, I just want to say thank you all for joining us for this much time. I know Tyler has to scoot, so I just wanted to thank the panelists for their time and for sharing their expertise and knowledge on this subject. And to our guests, the event also said that it would end at 8:30, so if you have to leave, that's understandable. But if you want to stick around, Kimberly and Paul have agreed to stay a bit later to keep talking about this. I know there's quite a lot of interest in this topic, so yes, we'll stick around for a bit longer if people would like to do that. Thank you, Tyler.
Thanks, Carrie, and everyone. Bye.
All right, so we will keep going. I know, Barry, you had a comment/question if you want to go ahead.
Well, actually, I had a question for Tyler and for Paul and a comment. Um, the one for Tyler, which somebody else might take a shot at. Um, when we manage most of the fisheries in Newfoundland and Canada, we do so by regulating the amount we can catch, the quota. The most successful fishery we have in Canada is lobster, and there we don't have a quota. And I've done some research on that sort of thing, and I think that we could do a lot better economically and also from a sustainability and societal point of view if we adopted a non-quota based management regime for other species as well. So that was a comment I was hoping Tyler would be able to make a comment on. Paul, you brought up about the redfish in the Gulf. Do you foresee that, like the shrimp, that was a large offshore factory freezer operation being changed by the minister to benefit coastal communities, that the quite large is, I don't think people realize how large the redfish stock is in areas 1 and 2. Do you see a potential that a similar kind of social disruption would occur, or will the people who own the factory freezer trawlers have gotten smart this time and won't let it occur again? And Kimberly, for you, I wonder if you've read anything about a book by Rick Williams on the future of the fishery, and he brings up, is very strong on what he calls occupational pluralism, and that is because fishing is by and large a seasonal operation, it is important that harvesters be allowed, as part of being a fisherman, the right to have more than one skill and more than one trade, so that if they work 5 or 6 months or 2 or 3 months or 10 months in the fishery, they can go to work at something else and thus get 12 months salary. And that is how we will keep people who are, quote, permanent fishermen, if we allow them to have other occupations as part of being a fisherman, as opposed to the way it is now, where it actually stops people from being fishermen. It's a very interesting concept, and that I think it's worth looking at by anyone who wants to. The name of the book is Future of the Fishery A Future for the Fishery by Rick Williams, and it's only just recently published. Okay, that's enough for now.
Should I go first, Carrie?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I work with Rick on that occupational, well, not the book itself, but some research he did a few years ago for the Canadian Council on Professional Fish Harvesters around that. So it's a really interesting set of issues that relates to some of the issues that Kimberly mentioned. But back to your question directed at me. The redfish is, it's a very different context today. I think, federally we have, a context where, reconciliation is playing a big role. So my understanding, and I haven't followed the redfish in a lot of detail in terms of what's happening most recently, but as I understand it, there are a number of partnerships, maybe with the Halivu First Nation on the West Coast, that they've been involved in some experimental fishery, I think maybe with the FFAW and maybe the Berry Group, maybe in different arrangements there. But I think reconciliation will play a factor in who gets access to the fishery. I'm not sure. I don't think it will certainly all go to a factory freezer context. There are some players, I guess, in the fishery who, I think on the Nova Scotia side, who have been sort of involved in redfish and processing side for a number of years before this. So they're, I would guess that their argument is that they have this sort of historical legacy argument that they should get more access. And that's often the debate, right? So, some industry players will say, well, we've relied on this and we want to continue relying on it. Others will say we've been excluded from previous fisheries. We want the right, we're adjacent to it, so the adjacency principle might come into play. In the Gulf, it's more complex because you have multiple provinces and multiple players. So, I haven't followed it really closely, but it's going to be really interesting to see how it's set up. After decades of challenges and sustainability, I think everyone wants to get it right, but there's a lot of pressures to get access from big, powerful interests, of course. And I think the fishery is the kind of fish and species and context where I think the only method of fishing currently being explored is trawling. So that automatically leaves out a lot of players and interests, right? And focuses it on certain ones. So I'll leave that one there.
I'd like to make a couple of points. I like to talk about the gear, of course, from the viewpoint of habitat and protecting habitat for the fish, because if you damage the habitat, you've literally destroyed the furniture in the house and the fish who wants to come back to a house that's empty of furniture. So, using gear that doesn't damage the habitat is always the best way to go. So if you think about using hook and line, that's awesome. Even better than hook and line, of course, would be to put your scuba gear on and use a spear. But that's probably not very practical. So where can you go with that? Also, the other thing about gear and being selective in the kind of gear that you use is that if you increase effort, then that is also a way of controlling the amount of fish that the fisher person can catch. So if you increase the amount of effort that it takes to catch the fish, you're going to reduce the amount of quota that you have to give out. And so that's another way of managing it too. Sorry, I've got dogs running across my desk. So if you think about the fishery as it was traditionally prosecuted here for cod for hundreds of years, it was hook and line, and you couldn't fish that out. It only got fished out when you had factory freezer trawlers. So there's an example of how using hook and line for hundreds of years you were able to control without even putting a quota on it. You were able to control the fish and manage it very well. So I really love being able to say that we need to just fish one fish at a time and handle one fish at a time and preserve the fish for the future. That being said, we love to be able to have cheap food, but that's not necessarily a good thing anymore. There's a whole movement called slow food and slow fish, which talks about local food and being willing to pay more for our local food and making certain that we create less waste and pay people who grow our food or catch our food more of what their labor is worth. And so that's a consideration when we look at migrant farmers and what they're dealing with right now with COVID and thinking about paying people what they're worth. So packaging all of that together and thinking about small-scale fishers fishing with gear that doesn't damage habitat. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Sounds like your puppies have something to say too. Jack shared some comments about lobster. I don't know, Jack, if you wanted to share those with the group, or I can read them out.
Yeah, sure. Well, just real quick, in my last project, I was just working for DFO for a few months on looking at all of their fishery management plans, and on lobster, they base the quota on last year's catch. So in other fisheries, you base the quota on where the biomass is every year, but on lobster, they kind of count it as the more lobster landed every year means the fishery is healthy, so you can therefore allow it to go on and kind of lessen management measures. And again, I'm not familiar with the difference of the physiology of all these different species, but I think as Tyler mentioned earlier, with climate change, Nova Scotia is in a really sweet spot. So I'm based in Nova Scotia now, and so the management measures are quite lax because it's bringing such widespread economic benefit to rural communities. So it's quite popular to keep those quotas high, especially if year after year they keep coming. And again, that might be antithetical to thinking eventually we might reach a point where that reaches a crash. But as of now, there's a lot of complex science around that, but they do base a lot of the decisions based on last year's catch. So that's just what I know from it. Thank you.
Interesting. Thanks, Jack. Simon, you have a question.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking about climate change and the fisheries, how they're both this sort of, this global problem, and there's sort of like this kind of massive, wicked problem that has these global issues that need to be sort of kind of confronted and challenged. Where, like with climate change, if Donald Trump decides that they don't want to participate in reducing emissions, then, well, we're kind of screwed in a lot of respects. And it kind of happens, I feel like, in the same way with fisheries. If an industrial trawler just wants to scoop everything up in international waters, it feels like we don't have a lot of utility to fight against that. But I'm thinking more, these industrial trawlers, and they all come from anywhere around the globe. Do communities around, like, internationally, like, have some sort of organization where they basically kind of confront these issues and they want to solve the issues the way that you see it, Kimberly, for instance, but like on a global scale? Have you ever thought of that, like reaching out to Indonesia, for instance, and how you're kind of probably facing the same challenges as coastal fishermen there? I'm just kind of curious about that.
One of the things that we champion, of course, is getting more girls and women involved in fishing, whether that's the food fishery, whether that's a commercial fishery. And there are international organizations that do that very same thing. And so we are, they champion for us. And Women in Seafood, for example, our Girls Who Fish program, we won a video contest, placed third in an international film contest, and that film traveled around the world and went to film festivals and fisheries conferences, and so everybody knows about our Girls Who Fish program all around the world, except our own government doesn't know about it. But yet the government of Canada is a signatory on the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fisheries, which a cornerstone of that is gender equity and equality. And they could just support our Girls Who Fish program, and they could check that off for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, so that we could spread this to other communities. So it's really frustrating when you can connect with people so easily now around the world, and but yet you can't get your voice heard to the people who can change policy. And so that's where we are. You just can't get the fairy godmother to listen to you so that she can wave her wand. And that's what we need. We need the fairy godmother to listen to us and do that wand waving, because we need access to fish. And Saturday, Sunday, Monday doesn't cut it during the recreational fishery, because we connect with other nonprofits, and that just doesn't work. So, but I hope that answers your question. If you want a list of organizations, I'd be happy to share those with you. And I'll try to put some things too in the chat box, some websites for everybody to take a look at too.
Thank you, Simon and Kimberly. There's some good conversation in the chat too about the lobster quota. And so there is no lobster quota, but there are management measures. But in Nova Scotia, at least, they have a total allowable catch. And Robin says she really appreciates the intersectionality of the panelists. So great to know that the experts are thinking about all the interconnectedness. And yeah, I'd like to echo that comment as well. Thank you, Robin. Are there any other questions, comments people want to share about how, how we can protect our fishery, how we're seeing changes to it, any concerns that we have about the way it's being managed, or maybe any success stories? I know that I Really appreciate communities like Petty Harbor that have made their harbor a marine protected area and only allow handline cod. I know that there was some, maybe that's changed a little bit with some fish. So, disclosure, I do work with Kimberly, and she made us do all this research about fishery, and one of them was about some of the great work that Petty Harbor did to create a marine protected area and to only allow handlining cod, which is like a slower method, a more humane method of fishing. But after the cod moratorium, they did start allowing gill nets for other fish, which is too bad. And I would love to see more communities make their harbors marine protected areas and push back against trawlers and gill nets. I think that is one great way we could build resilience. Any other questions, comments before we wrap it up? All right. Well, I guess we'll leave it there. Thank you all for taking the time tonight to talk with us about the fishery. We know that this is such an important issue for our communities and for the social fabric of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I hope that we can work together to better protect our fishery. We will be using notes from tonight's conversation to help further the work of the Social Justice Cooperative and the Memorial University Climate Action Coalition on this front. And I invite you all to get involved in these organizations. I'm going to put their emails again in the chat if you'd like more information about what they're up to. So yeah, and thank you, Kimberly, for all these links. We'll be sure to save those as well. And yeah, we'll be sending out some information to everyone who registered today. So we'll send out those links too. Yeah, so thank you all again for taking the time tonight, and really appreciate you coming out to this. So thank you and good night.
Thank you, Carrie. Bye.
Good night,
Bye, everyone.
everybody.
Good night.
Night.